My name is Johnny, and I'm here with the legend, Stacey Malkan. She's been working as a long time as an advocate and a journalist on some of the most important issues, outlining some of the fraud and compromise happening in big agriculture. She's a founder of U.S. Right to Know. Stacey, thanks for joining today. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it's an honor, and I appreciate so much work you've been doing. I wanted to start talking about, the Monsanto papers and some of the revelations that came out of that. What are one of the most surprising thing that bore out of that about their deception there?
Well, there's a lot, and the Monsanto papers are documents that came out of the trials with over 100,000 farmers and groundskeepers and others suing Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, claiming that their cancers were caused by exposure to Roundup herbicides. And also at my group, US Right to Know, we did a major investigation parallel to the trials to try to get at how these companies were running their disinformation campaigns. And I can tell you a little later about why we did that. But the result was tons of documents coming out into the public that had never been seen before. And we poured through them to really see what are the patterns that they're using to try to convince the public that this herbicide, for which there is much independent science showing many health harms associated with it, to try to convince the public it's safe. And what we found was they were spending huge amounts of money, tens of millions of dollars a year on front groups, on science denial tactics, on attacking scientists and journalists who raise concerns, flooding online spaces with trolls to attack people. They were monitoring journalists and advocates around the world. It really is the most astonishing thing is just the amount of effort they have to put in consistently, causing a drumbeat of disinformation to try to protect this pesticide and also their business model, which is really tied to the use of this pesticide and also genetically engineered crops that resist glyphosate, and not only glyphosate, but now a combination of pesticides that they're using on these crops.
Right. And of course, the Monsanto papers were some revelations that came out through some subpoenas in the courts back in around 2016. And yeah, we just got a great inside look about, the schemes they were doing to put forth propaganda, to, attack scientists doing good work, to attack journalists. They even had this scheme to leave no comment left uncounted on social media. A troll army to just flood and astroturf and post this nonsense everywhere. Uh, can you tell us any more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really astonishing. Leave nothing responded to. And they were working, of course, with the biggest public relations firms in the world. Who knows how many people assigned to online spaces. But I think a lot of people experience that even on their own Facebook pages. Like my mom, when she would post about GMOs or glyphosate, she would say, just weird people come onto my page and comment like, yes, this is orchestrated. And we could see the fingerprints of the orchestration, where people would come out in a flood and start attacking a certain scientist or journalist. They really can't survive the science. That's the bottom line of this story. The pesticide companies are up against the wall with very strong science showing that the way they grow food and control the agricultural market, it can't continue. For a long time, they relied on glyphosate and GMOs as a key profit line, but glyphosate stops working, the weeds are resisting, and now they're genetically engineering crops, corn and soy, to resist not just glyphosate, but dicamba and 2,4-D. And the science is showing that the combinations have far enhanced toxicity than just one pesticide alone. And there's so much that EPA is not even considering when it does its safety assessment. So that's all, the veils are coming off. I think people know, they're worried, farmers are worried. And we need to be having a conversation in this country about how we can transform food systems to grow food. And that's the thing about the US too, is that most of our most fertile farmland, the best farmland in the world, is being used not to grow food, but to grow corn and soy that feeds cows and cars through biofuels and ultra processed food factories making, high fructose corn syrup and other junk ingredients for junk food. So let's fix that.
It's really incredible, the whole ethanol thing. It's such a boondoggle. It seems like more energy goes into it than if they just used petrol or gasoline, and the pollution isn't any better, and it's bad for the engine. So now you think about the carbon footprint of creating new cars all the faster. So yeah, just a real boondoggle there. But
Makes sense. Makes no sense. But I think we can have a food system that makes sense, but we're going to have to rein in these corporations with laws like other countries have, banning some of the worst pesticides. We use pesticides in this country that are not allowed in Europe: atrazine, paraquat, chlorpyrifos. Strong, strong science. These chemicals are sprayed all over our food. Why? Because the pesticide industry is so powerful, they're telling the US government what to do. And we can stand up against that, and we have to.
Paraquat's been in 70 plus countries, including China, who is the main manufacturer of it, who's selling it to us, who's now lobbying for a liability shield. They don't want to stand by their product. They want to take away our right to due process, a right to a jury trial, a right to be heard about this. And this is what they've done with vaccines. And, it's just, it's a suspension of rule of law where it matters most. And, I've heard you talk about how, this shows that they're desperate. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, this is really a huge deal, what you just mentioned, the liability shield. It's the one protection that we do have in the United States, is the right to sue companies that cause us harm, and they're trying to take that away. And Bayer came out and said, well, if you don't protect us from liability, we'll have to stop selling glyphosate. Well, isn't that how the market's supposed to work? If something's dangerous, if people don't want it, you stop selling it. Instead, they're trying to, cower behind politicians to give them immunity shields. And it might work. It might actually work. 2 states have so far given Bayer immunity from failure to warn. So they can't be caught in the courts for not warning that their product may cause cancer. The federal government's trying to do that. North Carolina is going to be voting on, they folded it into the Farm Bill to try to give politicians, cover. Well, we had to vote for the Farm Bill. I think it's time for everyone in these states and at the federal level to get really loud and say, absolutely no, we will not give these companies immunity and not take away the right of Americans to sue when the science shows and juries decide that a company was responsible for causing their cancer or other harm. It's just absolutely no. So we'll see.
I mean, it goes to the whole point of having a society, it's like the Magna Carta. It's like, taking away, our foundational rights that are most core. It's the First Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Seventh Amendment. And it's just absurd that they could even, propose it. I think that I'd like to see us use this as a way to turn the energy to wake people up about, like you mentioned, so many of these poisons that are banned in so many countries. We spoke about the practice of pre-harvest desiccation. They're spraying some of these poisons directly on our crops at harvest, our grains, our beans. Can you expand on that a little bit for us? Why are they doing this?
Yeah, sure. So glyphosate is used, and it's as you said earlier, it's a bigger problem in the US than other countries because we allow GMOs to be grown, because glyphosate will kill everything green except a plant that is genetically engineered to resist it. So it's sprayed all over GMO corn, GMO soy, but it's also used as you said, a desiccant for wheat and beans. And that means that that it's sprayed on these crops when farmers are ready to harvest them to basically uniformly kill them. So they all die at once, easier to harvest, but that also leaves high levels of glyphosate in food that is directly goes into processed foods, breads, and anything with grains. And so some of the highest levels of glyphosate will be found in wheat products and also the beans. if they're not organic. So that's a key piece. The organic farmers don't use this process. So for me, and I'm a mom of an 11-year-old, I really look to buying organic wheat and grain products whenever possible, just to try to reduce glyphosate. And that is to the extent that there is good news. We do have control somewhat over the amount of these pesticides that we're consuming, because we can, some of us, not everyone, because the foods are not available everywhere. But where you can purchase organic foods, you'll get less of these pesticides, even though the drift now is a problem everywhere. And again, this is really a US problem in a lot of ways. I want to emphasize that point, because it does not need to be this way. And we can and should demand accountability for our government to stand up for public health. And I think a lot of people thought the Trump administration would do that. And unfortunately, it looks like the Republicans in the administration might support these immunity bills. So I think there's a real need to call that out and say, why can't we ban pesticides that are banned already in other countries?
Right. That would be the bigger ask. And then, of course, yeah, why are we spraying these on our crops at harvest? This is crazy. And you mentioned the drift, just a small amount of drift can really, what the way that glyphosate works is that it's a chelator, right? And this makes it an antibiotic. It kills the bacteria, kills everything green, kills the bacteria, kills the insects, kills the fungus, but safe to spray on our food that we're going to eat. Go figure.
Yeah.
But it's a chelator, so it ties up the nutrients. So, and just a little bit of drift from a neighbor's use can make the next farm over that is grown organically, make those nutrients less bioavailable. This is a thing about our food, is that you got to eat 8 carrots to get the nutrients you got from 1 carrot 40 years ago, right? What do we do about this?
Yeah. Evidence is killing bacteria both in the soil and then also in our own guts, which may be related to a lot of food intolerances and allergies. And again, it's not just glyphosate. On the drift issue, I want to say dicamba, because glyphosate stopped working, Bayer came along and said, well, we're going to genetically engineer crops now to also resist dicamba. Now, again, their own documents showed that they knew that this was going to be a problem, because dicamba has a huge drift problem. It just drifts over, hundreds of acres, and farms across the Midwest were decimated with dicamba. And the evidence came out that, well, they suspected, the documents showed, but it's already done. So, I mean, the list of just wrongdoing and bad activity from these companies is so long. And I think we, again, just really have to demand that the government reins them in, because there's no other way. They're not going to do the right thing based on science. So
You
I
talk
lost
about
track of the question, but
no, that's good. No, you talked about the drift. That was it, and
yeah.
the chelation, the nutrients. I want to talk about them being the wrongdoing. So many revelations came out. They're kind of they act like the CIA or something, the way they follow all the journalists, all the different scientists that are doing anything critical of them, and the actions, they act like the mob when it comes to them, going after them, attacking them viciously. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's really stunning. And I mean, I think another dynamic we've seen in industry is just further concentration of power of a few companies. Now Bayer, Syngenta ChemChina, Dow DuPont, which is called Corteva, and BASF own most of the world's pesticides, majority of the world's seeds, and they have long histories of corruption, science denial, like they won their markets by, breaking rules and morality the most. That's kind of how I see it. And so I think mob rule is exactly the right analogy, because again, the tactics are just relentless and also desperate. And I bring that up because their business models are on the line. For us to say, we could be using our farm resources to feed nutritious food to people and provide living wage for farmers if we broke away from this system of dependency on a pesticide treadmill. It's like a drug. They hook the farmers on drugs, and then they can't get off of them, and then the costs continue to go up. So farmers are not doing well in this system either. And it's really bad. This is related, the chemical industry and PFAS chemicals. There's a movie called Dark Waters, which maybe you've seen or your viewers have seen, with Mark Ruffalo. I cried my eyes out when I saw that movie, because I've worked on this stuff for 20 years, and I know it's bad about how chemical and pesticide companies deny science and lie to the public. But the extent they're willing to go, which is laid out in that movie, like they knew a chemical was causing harm, they knew it was ubiquitous in our waterways, and now we know these chemicals last, they call them forever chemicals, and are disrupting many physiological endpoints in our bodies. I mean, it's insane. The only response to this is laws that will rein these companies in. So I hope we can get to that point of an honest discussion with our government to say, like, we can't, and both parties are implicated. This is a decades-long problem. With glyphosate, you can see 40 years of records showing how the EPA, would silence scientists who were raising concerns, or, use only industry data and not even look at independent data. I mean, it's almost ridiculous. The assessment, when you look at the details, it absolutely cannot stand on its own 2 feet. They don't look at independent science. They don't look at so much that is known about the health risks. So we have a big problem on our hands.
You would think it would be the other way, right? That they wouldn't look at any industry science, right? This would clearly have a bias. These corporations, they're making billions in profit every year. They got a lot on the line. They're serial criminals. They've been found guilty of fraud again and again. But instead, it's the other way. We don't look at independent science, and we only look at theirs. How could this be?
I mean, it's an obvious conflict of interest, and I think everybody knows that. But again, it's a systemic change that we need to say the EPA needs to be using modern science and looking at real world exposures of chemicals. But they're not. And instead, right now, we're, tossing the scientists out on the street and gutting any regulations that we do have. It's really crazy.
You mentioned PFAS, and I just want to bring this up that, there's also section, is it 507 here in the House Appropriations Bill coming up? We're using toxic sludge. This is, waste from sewage that is not treated very much at all. That does have, we're finding that it does have PFAS in it. And what this section seeks to do is limit any action on this issue. This is destroying farms. Farms are going under. There's a great farm in Maine. Some friends are at. They do dairy cows, and their milk from those cows are no good anymore. They've culling the cattle, and this is happening all over. And so what Section 507 seeks to do is to, it's an industry giveaway, kind of limits any action on this issue. And go ahead.
That's just crazy. Thank you for bringing this up. And, in that movie, Dark Waters, the reason they first understood the problem was because the cows were totally deformed. I mean, the evidence is just very strong. We do not want this stuff in our food, on our land, in the soil. And, demand Congress doesn't do this. I mean, there's a very loud and vibrant political movement. Make America Healthy Again, has risen to the top of media coverage, and I think also somewhat political influence, but that influence needs to be used, and now's the time. This is, so far what we've seen from the Trump administration is giveaways to the pesticide companies, and chemical companies. That's one example. The pesticide liability shield is another. Pesticide industry lobbyists, and they're running EPA and with far too much power. I think the swamp needs to be cleared with the pesticide and chemical industry first, because it matters every day to our children's health.
It really does. It really does. And you talked about the GMOs and how America is well ahead. I saw a chart that just shows that, going back to the year 2000, we were just about the only country really implementing it. And it was already about 40% of our food. And now we're closer to, 90%. And yeah, so many studies coming out that show that, you talked about Seralini's study and on and on. That these GMOs can be toxic and they're not really tested, and if they are tested at all, they're only of course tested by industry who doesn't publish studies that go against their narrative.
Right.
Can you touch on the dangers of GMOs that way a little bit?
Yeah, I think this is a huge point for industry. They don't want us talking about the problems of GMOs. And as you said, it's mostly a problem here. There are a few other countries, Argentina, where farmland has just been turned over to the GMO scheme. And right now, as you mentioned, almost more than 90% of corn and soy grown in the US is genetically engineered. And the science they're not looking at the science. I just did an interview with a molecular geneticist, Michael Antonio, who is one of the leading researchers on the risks of GMOs and glyphosate. And he was explaining, I think it was a really important discussion about how any science that does exist on GMOs, which, as you said, was done by industry, studies not published, but only looked also at one trait. They engineered it to resist herbicides or produce an insecticide. But now, because that technology is failing to get around the weeds and the insects, they're putting multiple stack traits in this corn and soy. So they have multiple Bt toxicants that kill insects, including multiple herbicide resistant genes that resist dicamba and 2,4-D and glyphosate together. And when you add all that up, this food is super toxic in ways that nobody's looking at or done studies, because the studies that, and by nobody I mean government or regulatory agencies, the independent scientists have been doing the science, which is being ignored by the regulatory agencies. And there's a lot to see there. They see consistent problems with liver and kidney toxicity, with gut disruption, with the markers leading to DNA damage, leading to cancer. I mean, it's just a clear picture is emerging in science that EPA is not even looking at. And so we need to come into the 21st century with our science at these regulatory agencies as a first step. And because EPA says it's safe, I mean, it's laughable. At this point, it's absolutely laughable. But the recent report that came out of the Make America Healthy Again Commission basically said we're going to devote resources to convincing the American public that our regulatory systems are just fine and EPA science is just fine. So that's not helpful. That's not helpful. We need real science. We need modern science. We need EPA to be looking at independent science and figure out how to grow food that isn't toxic.
Yeah, the EPA is just thoroughly captured, and I think it's hard for anyone to argue about that. And yeah, you talk about the GMO testing. As I understand it, if it looks like a corn and it tastes like a corn, they say, well, it's just there's an equivalent, so it's just as safe as a corn, which is just absurd. Is that right?
It is absurd. Yeah, that is what the law is based on, this idea of substantial equivalence. Although, again, they never released any science actually showing that. They just kind of said it. This was in the 1990s, by the way, Dan Quayle was vice president. And it was a whole deregulatory initiative of the Bush administration in which they said GMOs are going to be, just basically not regulated, and we'll just assume they're equivalent to regular foods. But science and Antonio talks about this in our interview. He's established clearly that it's not the same. He finds hundreds of compositional differences in GM versus non-GM corn.
Well, they compare the technology to a scalpel, but I think a better comparison is that of a shotgun. I think they have no idea what they're doing, as I understand it. So for like the GMO corn that's Roundup Ready, they found a gene in a microbe, and I imagine they tried to get it into that corn, 10,000 times, just throwing everything against the wall, and it worked once by some miracle, and they went with it. But this technology, even if it was accurate and precise, they don't know what they're doing. They're in there just flubbing around, and they're turning us all into guinea pigs. It's like programming, and well, there's going to be bugs in the code, and you're just unleashing this on all of us, you know. Uh, and you're not studying it, so the dangers and the compromises, and we have so many other environmental toxins that they're not even getting you know, studied and looked at. It's just incredible.
Yeah, that's true. And even with the new CRISPR technologies, they again go in with the precision framing, but studies show, like, the scientists have described it as like chaos in the DNA, just like mass changes that they don't know how to do how to deal with complex systems without getting unintended effects. They just can't do it. And so it's rather crude, the genetic engineering technology. They figured out, yeah, these two traits, we can make it resist our chemicals or produce insecticides. But what they haven't been able to do, but they spend tons of money convincing us that someday they will do, is anything that has actually a consumer benefit, like enhanced nutritional quality or drought resistant. Like, no, they buy up plants that are already drought resistant and then stick a genetic engineering trait that they can patent into them so that they can then own the genetics that farmers have to then buy from them every year. It's a business scheme, and it's not working well for anyone except these corporations.
Yeah, it's really terrible, right? So they're patenting life, they're patenting the code of life, and whether you believe that came from a creator or billions of years of adaptation, they're taking that, right, and they're just doing a little, yeah, put a bow tie on it, put a little twist on it. I think Vandana Shiva made a great point. When they're patenting these things, they don't have like the original, so they can't even show. They're not even showing, oh, this is where it came from, and this is the change we made. So right, they're just getting a patent on the whole genome there. Absolute absurdity, and I think, yeah, whether you're somebody who's an atheist or a person of faith, you look and you say, listen, this is we're in a complex homeostasis, and everything's very intricate and delicate, and we see example after example of whole ecologies collapsing due to introducing foreign species, and that's exactly what they're doing. That's the danger they're running with all of these genetics they're introducing. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree. I think that's put very well. The genetic changes and also the chemicals and pesticides that are relatively new to the human experience, really since the 1950s. And, they find hundreds of chemicals inside the bodies of all of us, even in the umbilical cord blood of newborn babies. And most of them didn't even exist when my own grandmother was born. So you said earlier, it's a huge experiment on our health, and that absolutely is what it is. And we see in American healthcare statistics, it's not going well. A huge rise in chronic diseases, and a lot of that's ultra processed foods, which is directly tied to this whole system that we're talking about. The corn and soy, it's just a pipeline to ultra processed food, cows and cars, not nutritious food to feed people. So yeah, I mean, we have a lot of problems, but I also do find some comfort in the fact that they're relatively new, that other countries are solving them or at least making progress. There are alternatives available, and people, I think, are waking up to this on a mass scale. And what is it going to take to change the politics in the US? I don't know. I think we need to stop buying toxic products from toxic companies as a first, because often politics does follow the market. So I think it's important that we all do what we can to buy organic, buy safer products, make our own, grow our own, support people who do, and also educate our communities about the risks and the alternatives and the need to change policy to rein in these corporations.
Absolutely, yeah. Vote with our dollars there, and that I think that it's part of their whole narrative too, that they put out, that they say, hey, we organic's not perfect anymore, and of course that's true because of the drift problem you mentioned and other reasons. But hey, I say if it's 10% safer, I could feel 10% better. Let's do that. 10% less disease that we're feeding our children. And but really, when you do look at how much better organic is than the alternatives, usually it's a whole lot better. I look at strawberries. It's like, oh, you can have one chemical or 15 chemicals. What would you choose? And we talked about glyphosate and GMOs, and look, it's not entirely the food that is responsible for us as the U.S. Being so much sicker than the rest of the West, but it is I think mostly our food, and then our medicine along with that, that is creating dozens of diseases going parabolic, which is contributing to our longevity really declining. And this is not just the last 3-4 years at the end of our lives we're losing. This is our vitality, and what we can get out of life, and how well we can be there for each other. And yeah, it's just really high time we say enough is enough with this nonsense, because it's getting worse every day, isn't it?
Yeah, enough is enough. I think it's getting worse, but people are waking up. Yeah, and I mean that's just stunning, and I think it really just says it all right there. We can do better, and we have to do better in this country.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for all the great work you're doing. And yeah, where can people find you? And yeah, how can we help to be the change?
Well, thank you so much. One thing I wanted to mention too about the organic is I've written about how the pesticide industry has a whole attack line on organic, and so they that's another. Sometimes I like to watch what they do to say like, oh, this is where the threats are. They don't want people buying organic food or sharing information about how we can protect our health by doing that. So you can find my writing at US Right to Know, which is usrtk.org. We have a public health newsletter that we put out once or twice a week with breaking news from our investigations. We continue to investigate and try to get under the cover of the pesticide industry, the ultra processed food industry, and expose the tactics that they use. And we also report on emerging public health science that is showing on the daily how these industries cause harm and what the health impacts are. So for our Right to Know, you can check out all that work. And I really appreciate you having this discussion with me, and platforms like this to really talk to our communities about the problems and also the solutions.
Yeah, this kind of stuff should be headline news every day on all the news channels, and it's not. It shows you the power of those ad dollars that are getting spent, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah, we've got a lot of challenges, but that also means a lot of opportunities to make change. I have to think of it that way. Otherwise, sometimes it's too hard to get up.
Let's make our food medicine again.
Yes,
Yeah.
medicine,
All
and
right.
it is a path to healing our bodies. And that huge drop in longevity that you showed, a lot of it is the ultra processed foods, which most people are eating for most of their diets. It's killing us. And there's good evidence showing that actually it is tied to early death, as well as many chronic diseases, not only in adults but also increasingly in children.
Yeah, that's the thing. The kids are the most vulnerable. I think that's what, the studies are really showing. Their kidneys aren't developed, so they can't filter out these toxins the way we as adults can, and they got their whole lives ahead of them. And growing up, development is a really complex, delicate process, and a lot of these poisons, they're endocrine disruptors. So they're really getting in the way of the signaling for how the kids should develop. And yeah, I think that so much of the narrative that's out there is there to mean as a cover up. I think that growing up 40 years ago, I didn't know anybody who was transgender, and now this is something that's being celebrated and everything. And then look, for anybody who's an adult, hey, live and let live. But for the kids to be encouraged in this way, and for us to not be in having the conversation about, okay, what's wrong with us, testosterone, estrogen, all of our hormones all out of whack. Instead of that being the discussion, they want us to celebrate the dysfunction that they're creating. It's the height of gaslighting, I think.
Though there's a huge effort coming from many corners to not look here at what chemicals are doing to our bodies. And we just put out a article today about a study that showed intergenerational effects of glyphosate exposure. They exposed mice to glyphosate, and the initial mice exposed, and their children showed really no effects, but the grandchildren and the great grandchildren showed multiple physiological effects. And they also saw DNA damage. So like this is the kind of stuff that we now can see in modern science that regulatory agencies aren't using because they don't want to see it. So yeah, there's a lot of efforts of like, see here, don't look here. And, I've studied propaganda for many years, and you can start to see, and I do encourage everyone to educate yourselves about how these companies run their propaganda campaigns and telling you where to look, where not to look. And we wrote a lot about that in the Merchants of Poison report, which you can find at usrtk.org, to just get a taste of the many, many games they need to run in order to keep us looking under the lamp for the keys when that's not where we lost the keys. It's just, and I really like how you pointed out the complexity and of ecosystems, of our microbiome, of the interconnectedness of all things. It does make it hard to show cause and effect, but the science is really pointing us in toward understanding that we need to make some serious changes in the way we grow and eat food.
You mentioned this fertility study there. That's just wild that I've seen other studies that show the same thing. Why is it that it would affect the third generation so much? Do they have a reason or a theory about why that's happening?
I mean, I think in this study today, it was the DNA changes. It was just changing the way DNA developed through the generations, which can then set you up for disease. So yeah, it's fascinating, epigenetics, and scientists are really just beginning to understand it. But it's sort of like the ultimate complexity. How can we factor for that? And I think we just have to use the totality of evidence as guidance, which says like, this, it's not good to be spraying glyphosate all over our food and exposing our kids to it, and many other problems. And like, let's just fix them instead of fighting for decades about there's nothing to see here, which is what the companies want us to do.
It reminds me of a study I saw about fertility, and I think this was more from the recent mRNA technology, but it was about how, the boys developing in utero, talking about the changes in the hormones there, and how, they was asking the question, would they be fertile? And so that would be the third generation, right? So that would be like, what's going to happen that way. And yeah, it's just, I go back to this first foundational idea, like, what's more important than the health of us and our loved ones? That's what's at stake here. It's our very lives being taken from us, and then even our freedoms. When you talk about these liability shields that they're proposing now, really the height of insanity. I go back to the Seralini study, right? So this was 25 years ago. This was he had 3 control groups, 10 mice just eating GMO corn, no glyphosate, then just glyphosate, no GMOs, and then a control group. And what he was finding was that in the GMO group and in the glyphosate group, massive tumors. And the industry really pushed back on that, and they got his studies retracted. And their reasons just seemed absurd to me. One was that he was using the wrong mice, that these mice are prone to cancer. And as I understand it, well, these are the mice that are used in all studies.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, that he was only using 10 mice per control group, which is like, well, he didn't say he was using 1,000 mice. He said he was using 10 mice. So, I mean, okay, he said he used 10 mice. And then meanwhile, I think we had a new mRNA version of a new vaccine that was approved a couple years ago. They only used 5 mice in their safety studies, right? Is that right?
I mean, the hypocrisy is stunning. There was a massive, all stops pulled effort to discredit Seralini, which unfortunately really took ground. And he wasn't the first. 20 years before that, it was Arpad Putzai who found, his mice were getting disrupted, like massive stomach issues from the BT GMO corn, and he was massively discredited and run under the bus. So that's what they do, is they attack scientists and hide any science they do have. and which they're really, the industry's not even looking at health effects when they study this. So they just don't want to know. And even when they do know, they have covered it up, as was the case with glyphosate. You'll see in the documents they're saying, oh, it's the formulation that's the problem, not the glyphosate alone. Well, that's one thing that's been pretty well established, that the added chemicals in the formulation make the toxicity way enhanced. So what does the EPA do? It will not look at that. Doesn't want to see that. And so where there's complexity, EPA wants to just put the blinders on and look at the one thing that they can control the outcome and keep this product on the market, because they're basically marketing for industry, is what some of our public agencies have become. But we can't just say like, oh, they're terrible, we need to take them back. We need the power of government to rein in these corporations. I don't see any other way to do it. So I just want to leave you with that thought to your listeners. Like, what can we do to make the US government work for us and for the health of our families, and standing for, let's get those longevity numbers back up. Let's live good lives and the best lives that we can. And in order to do that, we're going to have to take back our farmland from chemical companies.
Oh my gosh. So you mentioned earlier we got to get loud. So how are we heard? I've heard the best way is just to call our congressmen. We can call them all. I've been calling a bunch of them, and they don't ask for zip codes, most of them. So they think they're constituents in their own even localities. And I've been talking about some of these issues. Is that the best way for us to be heard, or do you have some other recommendations?
I think that's important. Call your representatives. Also look at what your state is doing. Some of the states really have active fights right now on the liability issue, because Bayer is seeing, well, we can make it work in the states, but some states have said no. Some states are also trying to ban some of the worst chemicals. So that's an important landscape for at least the beginnings of change. I think it's also important to get connected to groups that are working on this. There's lots of them. Are there Make America Healthy Again leaders in your community? Can you talk to them, work with them, put pressure on Republicans who do need them, did get elected because of them? In some cases, maybe you could make that argument, because there's a groundswell of support for getting pesticides out of our food. And RFK Jr. said, he wanted to do something about that. Well, now we find out he's handcuffed from doing anything about that. They're not letting him touch pesticides. In fact, they're letting the pesticide companies write their MAHA report, and it's just outrageous. So I hope that we can hear a loud pushback from that important constituency who does have the ear of Capitol Hill.
I just want to show this little infographic real quick. So, I think this really highlights when we're calling our conservative or Republican congressmen why they should be all in on this issue. This is a national security threat. Okay. And this is an assault on our family's fertility. This is an assault on our children. This is coming for our constitutional rights. This is all about informed consent, and this is what matters most. So, and you mentioned Trump. I heard Trump say so many times. He said maybe it's all the spray we're doing, all the spray. So, I think he has a good idea that the pesticides are involved. And I know Kennedy's all in on it. So it's just but I have heard that big ag's power over Congress is stronger even than big pharma's. It may be the strongest. So, just so much, billions of dollars at stake. I think it's like 12 billion a year in profits. Just how much Monsanto was making before being bought up by Bayer. So yeah, it's just they got a war chest, and we've got to do all we can about it. I heard somebody frame it like this, and I thought it was really powerful that, this is something that we need to address, or we're leaving it for our kids to address, and it's going to be so much worse for them. So,
yeah, I think that's good. That's true. And thank you for educating people. And I hope folks will go to our website, usrtk.org, read our reporting, sign up for our newsletter, and let's make America healthy again with smart policies, and by sharing the information about the truth about what science is showing about the impact on our families and our health, and the fact that we can all be healthier if we make better choices around food, but also better choices about policy.
Thank you so much, Stacey. I love the work you're doing. Yeah, let's heal.
Yeah, thank you.